faculty at DBMCI MDS Expert. The DBMCI MDS Expert team has come up with a new program, that is LMRP, Last Minute Revision Program. Now, this program is really helpful for the students or the MDS aspirants who basically finds difficulty in doing the revision just before the exam. So, as a periodontic faculty, I'll be covering my entire subject in a short span of time. Basically, I'll be covering the important points and the important things that are necessary to remember just before the exam, and I'll cover according to the units that as I have covered in my online videos. So, in a similar way, I'll cover the important points in each unit one by one. So, starting with the first unit, that is preventive orthodontics. Now we know that preventive orthodontics is basically a thing that is done before the malocclusion has occurred. And in terms of the pediatric dentistry, preventive orthodontics means space maintainers. Now space maintainers are basically given when there is a premature exfoliation of a primary teeth, or when we are going for the extraction of a primary teeth. Now there are various factors that are considered before planning a space maintainers, and we have already discussed these factors in the online video. Now the important things that one need to remember in these factors that are considered before planning a space maintainer is, the first thing that you need to remember is the amount of bone covering the unerupted teeth. And I have told that the amount of bone covering the unerupted teeth, especially in the case of the premolar, that is the succedaneous premolar tooth bud. And it is said that if the amount of bone covering the unerupted teeth, that is the succedaneous premolar tooth bud, is 1 mm, so the time taken by a premolar to travel through 1 mm of bone is 4 to 5 months. So this is a very important thing that comes in the exam as a clinical question, where they'll give you the amount of bone present over the unerupted teeth, that may be 2 mm, 3 mm, or 4 mm, and depending upon it, you need to calculate that how much time will be taken by a premolar to travel through that particular amount of bone. Then the second important thing that we have already discussed and you need to remember is that the time elapsed since loss. And I have told you that the maximum space loss occurs in the first 6 months of the extraction, or the first 6 months of the premature exfoliation of a primary teeth. So the second thing that you need to remember is the factor, that is the time elapsed since loss. And it is said that the maximum space loss occurs in the first 6 months. So always remember this point. This is really important for the exam. The another important thing that you need to remember is, that is the dental age of the patient. And we know that the dental age is basically the depends upon the last tooth that is erupted into the oral cavity. And in terms of the space maintainer, the important thing that you need to remember is regarding the Mickey's mental rule, that is delay before the 7 and acceleration after 7. And we have already discussed that if the primary molar is exfoliated before the age of 7, then there will be a delay in the eruption of the succeeding premolar tooth bud. And if there is an exfoliation of the primary molar after the age of 7, that will accelerate the eruption of the succeeding premolar tooth bud. So these three factors you need to remember. There are other factors also that we have discussed in the online video, but this is the important factor that you need to revise before the exam and must keep in mind before the NEET exam. Then we have discussed regarding the classifications of the space maintainer. Now we have discussed the classifications in the lecture also, and just a short revision related to the classification. And we have discussed the classification according to the Hitchcock, that is removable or fixed, with or without bands, functional, non-functional, active, passive, and the combination of above. Then according to the Raymond C. Thrope, that is classified as removable, complete arch, and individual tooth. And according to the Henrichsen, that is classified as fixed space maintainers and the removable space maintainer. Then the space maintainers are broadly classified into the fixed and the removable. So mainly we will be focusing on the fixed space maintainers. And before we start with the discussion of the space maintainer, the important thing that we need to remember for the exam is regarding the armamentarium also. Now we know that for a fixed space maintainer we will be using a band material. So I have given you the classification of the band material also, in which I mentioned the three columns. The first column basically depicts the thickness. Now this column basically depicts the thickness. So please remember the thickness, because they'll ask you in the exam regarding the thickness. The other two columns depicts the width and the length. But for the exam, you need to remember the thickness of the band material, because they'll give you the thickness and they'll ask you that for which tooth you'll be using this much of thickness of the band material, that is 0.003, 0.004, 0. Space maintainers are broadly classified into the fixed and the removable. So mainly we will be focusing on the fixed space maintainers. And before we start with the discussion of the space maintainer, the important thing that we need to remember for the exam is regarding the armamentarium also. Now we know that for a fixed space maintainer we'll be using a band material. So I have given you the classification of the band material also, in which I mentioned the three columns. The first column basically depicts the thickness. Now this column basically depicts the thickness. So please remember the thickness, because they'll ask you in the exam regarding the thickness. The other two columns depicts the width and the length. But for the exam, you need to remember the thickness of the band material, because they'll give you the thickness and they'll ask you that for which tooth you'll be using this much of thickness of the band material, that is 0.003, 0.004, 0.005 and 0.006. So these thickness basically denotes the number of the band material also. So it is for anterior teeth, bicuspid, primary molar and the permanent molar. Now, after the classification, we discussing the important points related to the space maintainer, and we'll discuss the space maintainer one by one. The first is the band and loop. We know that band and loop is classified as fixed, unilateral, non-functional, passive space maintainer. Now, you need to classify the space maintainer in such a way so that there are questions in the exam where they'll give you the name of the space maintainer and you need to classify it. So, the band and loop. The important point related to the band and loop is that we know that it is given when there is a unilateral loss. Yes, it can be given when there is a bilateral loss also, but the important thing that you need to remember for the band and loop, that it is especially given when the primary incisors are present. That I told you, that the primary centrals and the primary laterals. The another important thing that you need to remember regarding the band and loop is the width of the loop. The width of the loop is basically 8 mm. That is basically the buccolingual width of the succedaneous premolar tooth bud. So we say that the minimum width of the loop should be 8 mm. The another important thing is that they ask you that this anterior part of the loop rests at which area. I told you that the anterior part of the loop basically rests at the contact area. Then the another important thing that you need to remember regarding the band and loop is the modifications. Now in the modifications we have discussed, or we have already discussed regarding crown and loop. And for this the question generally come as the crown and loop is a functional or a non-functional space maintainer. So I told you that when we are giving a crown and loop, so suppose this is a tooth over which we have given a stainless steel crown. So we are not replacing the missing space. This is my E, this is D, and this is the primary canine. So we have extracted the primary molar. I am just giving an example that we have extracted the primary first molar, and we are giving the band and loop space maintainer. And when we encountered that the primary second molar is grossly decayed, so we need to do a pulpectomy. And after the pulpectomy, it's mandatory to give a stainless steel crown. So we have given a stainless steel crown over the primary second molar, and we have soldered a loop on it. So this crown and loop is basically is a non-functional space maintainer, because we are not replacing the missing space. If we are replacing the missing space some with teeth, then it is called as a functional space maintainer. So always remember, crown and loop is a functional space, non-functional space maintainer. Then the another modification related to the band and loop is the mains space maintainer, where the band and loop is reduced to half, and it is especially given in the cases of the macroglossia. Then the third modification is something related to the the third modification that we have already discussed in the classes regarding the crown, band and loop, where we basically adapt a band over the stainless steel crown rather than basically soldering the loop directly onto the crown. We are soldering the loop onto the band, which is basically adapted on the stainless steel crown, and this we generally do it to prevent the distortion of the stainless steel crown, because we know that the minimum thickness of the stainless steel crown is 0.08 mm. So this thickness is very less. So to avoid the distortion of the stainless steel crown, we are making a modification such as crown, band and loop. And one more modification that we have discussed is regarding reverse band and loop. Now always remember, this is a very important thing. They ask you a clinical question regarding the reverse band and loop, and reverse band and loop is especially given when the suppose you have a primary first molar and the primary second molar is exfoliated, whereas the permanent first molar is partially erupted. So earlier we are moving from the distal to the mesial, now we are moving from mesial to distal. So we adapt a band on the primary first molar. So since we are moving from distal from mesial to distal, so we are adapting a band on the primary first molar, and then we make a loop over it. Now in this case the loop is reduced to not the loop, the loop is basically rested on the mesial marginal ridge. The loop is rested on the mesial marginal ridge of the unerupted or the partially erupted first molar. So in the reverse band loop, always remember that it is given in the condition when the first molar is partially erupted, because we cannot erupt a band on the first permanent molar which is partially erupted. So we need to make a band on the primary first molar where the loop is basically resting on the marginal ridge of the partially erupted first permanent molar. So these are the modifications that you need to remember for the band and loop space maintainer. Then we have discussed regarding the lingual arch. Now in the lingual arch, I have told you that it is classified as a fixed. Bilateral, non-functional, active slash passive space maintainer. I told you that that lingual arch is the only space maintainer that can be used as a regainer, and I told you that in the case of lingual arch, the important thing that you need to remember is, the first thing is that the anterior part of the lingual arch rests at basically 1 to 1.5 mm above the gingival margin, or it rests at the contact area. The another important thing that you need to remember regarding the lingual arch is that lingual arch is given when the permanent incisors have erupted, that is the permanent centrals and the laterals, because this anterior part rests on the cingulum. So if you place this anterior part in the case of the primary dentation, what will happen is that we know that the path of the eruption is from lingual to labial, so it will hamper the eruption of the succedaneous permanent incisor. So that is why the lingual arch is basically placed 1 to 1.5 mm above the gingival margin, or it is placed at the contact area. The another important thing that you need to remember regarding the lingual arch is the Hotz modification, in which I told you that in the Hotz modification we basically make two U loops just mesial to the first molar, that is also known as the Wilson loops, and this will help in the you can say it will help in the distalization of the molars and thus preventing the space loss. So that is why I told you that lingual arch is also known as a active space maintainer. Generally all the space maintainers are passive, but the lingual arch is the space maintainer in which we make basically two U loops, and by opening up these two U loops you will see the distalization of the molar, which will prevent the space loss. So the lingual arch is the only space maintainer that can be used as a space regainer. So this is a question that is regularly asked in the exam. Then we have discussed regarding the now this is basically a transpalatal arch. Now I told you that the transpalatal arch is given when there is a unilateral loss, and it is only given in the maxillary arch, and the loop is known as the omega loop. Now this omega loop basically prevents the bodily movement or the tipping of the molar. Then we have discussed regarding the Nance palatal also. Now Nance palatal is also given in the maxillary arch, and it is given when there is a bilateral loss. Now the anterior part, the another important question regarding the Nance palatal is that the anterior part of the Nance palatal basically rests on the rugae area. It rests on the rugae area. Then the last fixed space maintainer we have discussed is regarding the distal shoe. The synonyms for the distal shoe we have discussed is that it is known as eruption guiding appliance, then it is also known as the intra-alveolar space maintainer, and it is also known as Willet's appliance, because distal shoe was introduced by Willet's. Now most of the students generally get confused that whether it is a Roche's appliance. No, it is not a Roche's appliance. Nowadays the distal shoe which we are using is basically a Roche's modification. Now in this Roche's basically we are using the normal stainless steel wire, whereas in the design that was made by Willet, that is basically made up of cast metal that we have already discussed. So never said that the synonym of distal shoe is Roche's. The synonym of distal shoe is Willet. Now distal shoe is given especially when the uh, when there is a premature loss of the primary second molar and the permanent first molar is unerupted. So distal shoe is basically given to guide the eruption of the first permanent molar. So this V-shaped notch that is seen in the distal shoe, the question that generally they ask is that this V-shaped notch should be extend how much intra-alveolarly. So it should extend 1 mm below the mesial marginal ridge of the first permanent molar, that is the unerupted first permanent molar. And it is always preferred to give the distal shoe during the time immediately after the extraction. Now this is the another important question that is asked related to the distal shoe, that it should be given in the first setting or in the second appointment. Always the distal shoe should be given in the first appointment, that is on the day of extraction, because at that time the socket is generally open and one can easily measure the mesiodistal width related to the design of the loop, and which is basically extending intraellularly. And the another important thing is that you will not need to give the local anesthesia again, because once the patient comes in the next appointment, what will happen is the flap generally get closed, and that will be very difficult to place that V-shaped notch intraellularly. So that is why it is also called as eruption guiding appliance, because it guides the eruption of the unerupted first permanent molar. Then I've also told you regarding the space maintainer that is given for the anterior teeth, and I told you that the space maintainer that is only mentioned in the books regarding the anterior teeth, that is the pin and tube space maintainer, and it is basically given in the maxillary arch when the maxillary centers, the primary maxillary centers are missing, and the band is basically adapted on over the lateral incisor, over which we place a molar tube and pass a pin through that. So pin and tube space maintainer is the only space maintainer that is given in the anterior teeth, and it is especially given when there is a premature loss of the primary maxillary central incisor. Now this is in brief regarding the preventive orthodontics, that is the space maintainer. The rest regarding the removable space maintainer, we all know that if there are conditions that suppose they says that there is a you can say the extraction or the premature exfoliation of the primary first molar and primary second molar take place, then which space maintainer you will go for. We know that we know that the permanent first molar is unerupted. Then the space maintainer that we can go with only is with the removable partial denture. So in terms of the pediatric dentistry, we will not say it as a removable partial denture. We'll always say it as a removable functional space maintainer. So this is something related to the preventive orthodontics, that is the space maintainer. The next important points that I'll be discussing is from the topic the crowns used in the pediatric dentistry. Now, I have already discussed regarding the different crowns used in the pediatric dentistry, and I have told you that the crowns are basically classified on the basis of luted or bonded. And why I have discussed it on the basis of luted and bonded, because I told you that most of the questions are generally in the exam day that they ask you that all of the crowns are luted except, or all of the crowns are bonded except. So the classification of the crown that I have told you, please go through it once, because it's really important and help you to classify that okay, these crowns are the luted crowns and these crowns are the bonded crowns. Apart from that, I told you that the in the stainless steel in the stainless steel crown, we'll be discussing it as the main heading in the crowns used in pediatric dentistry, because most of the MCQs are from the stainless steel crown. Now in the stainless steel crown, I told you that the MCQs we'll be discussing is in the two parts. The first is regarding the tooth preparation that we are doing inside the patient oral cavity, and the second part of the MCQs is related to the crown that is available in the kit. So when it comes to the crown preparation part, so I told you something regarding the occlusal reduction. Then I've told you about the proximal reduction. Then is buccal reduction, and the lingual reduction. So the occlusal reduction that is required in the case of the stainless steel crown is basically 1.5 to 2 mm. Now this reduction is basically given by Kennedy and Nash. Then when it comes to the proximal reduction, the thing that you need to remember is that for a proximal reduction, two things are important. Either you can say that the amount of reduction required for the proximal surface is 1 to 2 mm away from the adjacent teeth, or the tine of the explorer should pass through and through. So these two options are basically correct for the proximal reduction, that is 1 to 2 mm away from the adjacent teeth, or the tine of the explorer should pass through and through. whereas I told you that the buccal and the lingual reduction will do a minimum amount of the reduction. But if a reduction is required, that is done around about zero point 0.5 mm, especially for the buccal surface, and it is done in the cases of the primary first molar, because when we see in the primary first molar on the buccal surface, you will see a marked cervical bulge. Also, you will see the constriction at the neck of the primary teeth. So this basically requires a reduction, a little bit of reduction, and that is only 0.5 mm, so that you can easily mask the stainless steel crown over the prepared to surface. So the amount of reduction that is done only in the cases of the buccal surface of the first primary molar, whereas the lingual surface requires the least minimal reduction. And why we are doing a little bit of reduction in the buccal and the lingual surface is because in case of the permanent teeth we have the things like, uh, you can say, when we do the wire bending in the case of the permanent teeth, you always see that there is an area that is known as the infrabulge area or the suprabulge area, especially when you are making an C class. But these things are not in the case of the primary teeth, especially in the case of the primary molars. So we never do a reduction on the buccal and the lingual surface. And in the exam, if there is a question like which thing basically makes the retention of this stainless steel crown, basically the reduction of the, or you can say the tooth preparation is the main key factor for aiding this retention of the stainless steel crown. When it comes to the luting cement, the luting cement does not aid in the retention of the stainless steel crown. It's only the reduction that we do in the cases of the primary molar. So these points need to be remembered for the exam point of view. Now, when it comes to the stainless steel crown that is available in the kit, so the MCQs that are related to the stainless steel crown which is available from the kit is, first is based on the classification. Now, before classification, the thing that you need to remember is that stainless steel crown was introduced by Humphrey, and this stainless steel crown was introduced in the year 1950. When it comes to the classification, I told you that it is classified as pre-trimmed, sorry, it is classified as untrimmed, pre-trimmed, pre-contoured. So in the exam they must be asking that which company basically manufactures the untrimmed crown or which company basically manufactures the pre-contoured crown. So always remember the crowns which are neither trimmed nor contoured are known as the untrimmed crown, and the example is, I told you, that is Rocky Mountain. Then the crowns which are trimmed but not contoured is Unitech, and the crowns which are basically trimmed as well as contoured are basically manufactured by 3M. So these three important points you need to remember regarding the classification of the stainless steel crown. Then the stainless steel crown, the another important thing that you need to remember is that whenever we get a stainless steel crown, we always select the stainless steel crown on the basis of the external diameter. We never select on the basis of the internal diameter. So always remember that the stainless steel crown is selected on the basis of the external diameter. Now before placing it over the two surface, we need to make some adjustments related to the stainless steel crown, and that is basically known as the festooning. Festooning is basically that you carve the cervical surface of the stainless steel crown, and these stainless steel crown has basically three types of the margin that you need to remember for the exam, that is smile, frown, and stretch S line. So these three margins are basically present in the case of the stainless steel crown. The smile margin is present on the buccal and the lingual surface. The frown margin is basically present on the proximal surface, where the stretch S line, I told you that in the, it is seen in the cases of the primary first molar, that too on the buccal surface of the primary first molar, because the primary first molar has a marked buccal bulge, and this buccal bulge basically basically cause a difficulty in the masking the stainless steel crown over the prepared tooth surface. So I told you that this stretch S line is basically made in the cases of the buccal surface of the first primary molar, which has a marked constriction at the cervical surface. Now once you have done the festooning, then you need to do some adjustments with the help of the pliers that are used in the case of the stainless steel crown. The first is that you will do the crimping. Now crimping is basically that is done at the cervical third of the stainless steel crown. So crimping is basically done at the cervical third of the stainless steel crown to aid in the retention of the stainless steel crown, so that the stainless steel crown should have a tight cervical fit. Now the crimping is basically done with the help of 417 crimping plier. Then you need to do a contouring. Now contouring is done in the middle third of the stainless steel crown, so that the crown can easily mask over the prepared teeth, and that is basically done by the 114 Johnson ball and socket contouring plier. So you need to remember the number of the plier, and the next is that I told you earlier also, that is 137 Gordon plier. Now this 137 Gordon plier is basically again used for the contouring in the middle third of the stainless steel crown, and this contouring basically aids in an effect known as the belling effect, because we are doing a minimal reduction on the stainless steel crown. For the stainless steel crown on the tooth surface, that is we are doing a minimal reduction on the buccal and the lingual surface, so we need to do a little bit of contouring. And for contouring, the number of the plier that we are using is 114 Johnson ball and socket contouring plier and 137 Gordon plier. Now if we need a tight proximal contact, then we basically use 112 Abels ball and socket plier. So please remember the number of the plier, because this question is repeatedly asked in the exam. You need to remember the number of the plier. Then the another important thing regarding the stainless steel crown is that once you have done the contouring and the crimping, then you will place the stainless steel crown. When you are placing the stainless steel crown over the prepared tooth surface, in case of the mandibular arch, always remember there is a question that it is placed from lingual to buccal, whereas in the case of the maxillary arch, you will place it from the buccal to palatal, and the answer is simple, that is because of the accessibility and the visibility. The another thing is that when you place a stainless steel crown over the prepared tooth surface, you will hear a voice that is known as a snap fit. So you need to remember this point for the exam point of view. The rest is regarding the modifications of the stainless steel crown, which we have already discussed. The modifications include basically the oversized crown, the undersized crown, but that is rarely asked in the exam, but you need to go through once regarding the modifications, that is for the root caries also, and especially in the cases of the open contact. Basically the modification that we do in the case of open contact is that we do the addition of the solder that will help to produce a tight proximal contacts when we have a open contacts between the two stainless steel crowns, or you will have a open contact when you are placing a single crown also. Then you can do the addition of the solder, that is a dental solder, and which will basically close the proximal contacts. So these are basically few of the modifications related to the stainless steel crown. Apart from that, I have discussed one of the important thing regarding the stainless steel is that is the cross technique. Now in the cross technique, I told you that this technique is basically given in the patients of bruxism, where we basically see that in the cases of bruxism, as the thickness of the stainless steel crown is less, so we need to increase the thickness of the stainless steel crown. So that is basically known as the cross technique. And the next I told you is regarding the Hall's technique also. Now Hall's technique, I told you that it is done in the cases, especially when you see that there is an increased carriage activity, and or you will see that the progression of the rate of the carriage is high. So in that case, what you can do is that you can give the stainless steel crown on the molars, and what you do is that you do a minimal. You will not do any reduction of the stainless steel crown. You will place the stainless steel crown as such, so that what happens is that when you place the stainless steel crown as such, you cut down the supply of nutrients to the microorganism, and this will help in the arrest of the dental caries. So that is basically known as the Hall's technique. So these are the things that you need to remember in the revision point of view for the stainless steel crown, okay, or the crowns used in pediatric dentistry. The next topic that I'll be discussing is related to pediatric endodontics. Again, a very important topic. You cannot leave it for the exam. It's really important. Now I'll tell you some important points that are really helpful for the revision purpose related to pediatric endodontics, and that is regularly asked in the exam. Now when it comes to the pediatric endodontics, the first thing that you always need to remember, that is why we are doing the pediatric endodontics. It is done because whenever there is a caries activity, and that has basically involved the pulp, so we need an endodontic procedure for that, and we need to save the primary teeth, because the primary teeth itself serve as a space maintainer, or you can say it serve as a natural space maintainer. So we need to save the primary teeth. Apart from that, the primary teeth aids in the phonetics, and it also aids in the mastication also. So the primary teeth itself has a main important role when it comes in saving the primary teeth. So the first thing that you need to remember in terms of pediatric endodontics, that it is different from the permanent teeth in terms of the differences that we generally study, that is the pulpal differences between the primary and the permanent teeth, and the important questions related to the pulpal differences between the primary and the permanent teeth that is regularly asked in the exam is, the first is related to the accessory canals. You always need to remember that in the case of the primary teeth, the accessory canals are located in the furcation area. The accessory canals are located in the furcation area, whereas in case of the permanent teeth, the accessory canals are located at the apical or the lateral area, and this is the reason that you see a radiolucency in the furcation of a primary teeth. Whenever you see a radiograph or the IOP X-ray, you see a radiolucency in the furcation area of a primary teeth. You will not see at the apical or the lateral area of the primary teeth. The another important thing that I told you, that in the case of the primary teeth, you'll see the increase internal and external resorption. Also, you will see the increase rate of reparative dentin formation. Now, while you see the increased rate of internal and external root resorption, and while you see increased rate of reparative dentin formation, now these two questions are regularly asked in the AIMS exam, and very important for the NEET exam also. So the reason is that the primary teeth has basically the increased blood supply, and we know that the pulp is basically a mesenchymal tissue. So these mesenchymal cells basically get differentiated into odontoblast, and some of the cells also get differentiated into odontoclast. Now these odontoclast cells are basically responsible for the resorption part, that is the internal or the external root resorption, whereas these odontoblast cells plays an important role because it derives the enzyme from the blood, and basically it activates the enzyme, that is the alkaline phosphatase. So again, an important question for the exam, that is the enzyme which is activated by the odontoblast for the formation of reparative dentin is alkaline phosphatase. Now this alkaline phosphatase derives calcium from blood, and this calcium from the blood is basically responsible for the reparative dentin formation. So again, an important point regarding the differences part. Then we have discussed regarding the diagnosis part of the you can say the pulpal disease, and we have discussed in detail regarding it in the online video classes. But the important thing that you need to remember always when it comes to the diagnosis part, that is the pulpal testing modalities. And the recent advances in the pulpal testing modalities is the use of the laser Doppler flowmetry and the pulse oximetry. So whenever in the exam they ask you that which method is basically best to assess the vitality of the pulp, definitely the answer is the laser Doppler flowmetry or the pulse oximetry. Now the pulse oximetry, I told you that again it's based on the oxygen saturation, and it depends upon the amount of the oxygenated or the deoxygenated hemoglobin that is present into the blood. So there are two lights I told you, that is the red light and the infrared light. The oxygenated hemoglobin absorbs more of the infrared light, whereas the deoxygenated absorbs more of the red light, and on the basis of that you'll get to know that whether the pulp is vital or non-vital. Whereas in the case of laser Doppler flowmetry, I told you that it is based on the velocity of the RBC cells. The principle on which it is based is the velocity of the RBC cells. Now this laser Doppler flowmetry helps in basically assessing the vitality of the blood cells, and in this case the red light is used, which is basically when uh, when it is placed, or when the red light is incident on the tissue, what happens is that it gets reflected back through the moving RBC cells, and this reflected light back which is back is basically detected by the photo detector. Now the reflected light will have a altered wavelength, and this altered wavelength will let you know that whether the pulp is vital or non-vital. So these are the two main important things that you need to remember for the exam, that is the laser Doppler flowmetry and the pulse oximetry. Then we have different modalities or treatment modalities that is used in the pediatric endodontics. That is, the first is the indirect pulse therapy. Now in the indirect pulse therapy, I told you that we basically remove the layer of the infected dentine and we leave the layer of the affected dentine, and then we place a layer of a calcium hydroxide, that is also known as a dicel, that you use normally in your clinics or your departments. Now this calcium hydroxide is basically placed over the affected dentine, and indirect pulse therapy is mainly indicated when the remaining dentine thickness is less than 0.5 mm. So you'll only do in the cases when the remaining dentin thickness is less than 0.5 mm. You'll remove the layer of the infected dentin and place a layer of calcium hydroxide over the affected dentin, and then you'll recall the patient again, and you'll see that after a period of 4 weeks, or you can say 1 month, that after a period of 4 weeks or 1 month, you'll see a radiopaque zone. Now this radiopaque zone will demarcate a layer of a reparative dentin. So the question that generally comes is that whenever you will recall the patient for the next appointment to see a layer of reparative dentin, that is, the answer is 1 month or 4 weeks. So you always need to remember regarding the indirect pulse therapy. The next procedure is direct pulse therapy. Now always remember, I told you in the online video classes also, that direct pulse therapy is contraindicated in primary teeth. The reason is that the primary teeth has the increased blood supply and the spread of infection is high, so we never do a direct pulse therapy in primary teeth. But when it comes to the permanent teeth, the things that you need to remember for the exam is that in case of direct pulse therapy, always remember that it is done whenever there is a pinpoint exposure or the size of exposure is less than 1 mm. Apart from that, you always need to remember that the pulse should be vital, or there may be a traumatic or iatrogenic exposure, and the duration is less than 24 hours, or the patient report you within 24 hours, then only you'll do a procedure such as direct pulse therapy. So in direct pulse therapy, you place a layer of calcium hydroxide over the exposed pulp, and then you cover it with a final restoration, that is, you can place a composite restoration over it. Then after direct pulse therapy, then is the next procedure that we undertake in the pediatric endodontics is the pulpotomy. Now pulpotomy, we all know that it is a partial removal of no sorry it's the complete removal of the coronal pulp, leaving the radicular pulp as such. So in case of the pulpotomy, we have a classification related to the different types of the procedure that we use in the case of the pulpotomy, and it's a big classification we have already discussed, and if in brief I'll discuss it again, that it is classified it into two, that is the vital or non-vital. In the vital, I have discussed you that it is divided into two, single sitting and two sitting. That is the formocrystal, electrosurgery and laser comes under single sitting. Then in the two sitting, we basically have the easily formaldehyde or paraformaldehyde devitalizing paste. Then after the devitalization, we have the preservation. In the preservation, we basically have ferric sulfate and glutaraldehyde, and last is the regeneration, that basically includes the bone morphogenic protein. Then in the case of the non-vital pulpotomy, we have the formocrystal, or we have basically a formocrystal or the beechwood cresol. So these are the things that we generally undertake in the pulpotomy, and we classify the pulpotomy on the basis of the materials that we generally use. Now, pulpotomy, for the pulpotomy, you need to remember one important thing is that pulpotomy is done only when the patient should not complain of any pain. The patient should not complain of any spontaneous pain. Now, this is a very, very important point regarding the pulpotomy, that the patient should not complain of any pain. The another important thing that you remember in the case of pulpotomy, that for a pulpotomy we do an access opening and then we do take a sharp spoon excavator. Now, with the help of a sharp spoon excavator, we excavate the entire coronal pulp, and after the excavation of the coronal pulp, we take a wet cotton pellet and we'll try to control the bleeding. Now, if the bleeding, or if we are not able to control the hemorrhage, now this is a sign that the inflammation has extended to the radicular pulp. So there is a bleeding from the radicular pulp, or you can say the advanced degeneration of the odontoblast cells has extended into the radicular pulp. So this is a question that is regularly asked in the exam, that what does the bleeding means, that after the after you are trying to control the hemorrhage, that bleeding basically means that the degeneration of the odontoblast cells has extended to the radicular pulp. Now, this is a very, very important question that is asked in the exam. So please remember this point, that if there is a bleeding from the radicular pulp, we will not go with the pulpotomy. Definitely, we will go with a procedure such as the pulpectomy, because the inflammation has extended to the radicular pulp. So these two important indications you always need to remember. There are other indications also, that there should be no sinus opening, or there should be no pus discharge, or there should be no fistula or retract. So these important things that you need to remember always, always, always when it comes to the indications for pulpotomy. Okay. Then the pulpotomy, I told you that it is basically classified on the basis of the different material or the fixative agents we use. The main things that you need to remember, the three important materials that you need to remember. We have discussed the other materials also, but for the exam point of view, always don't leave these important points, that is related to the formocresol, then related to ferric sulfate and glutaraldehyde. In terms of the formocresol pulpotomy, you always need to remember that formocresol pulpotomy was introduced by Sweet, and the another important thing is that the formocresol is always used in a ratio of 1:5. Now, this 1:5 is basically made with the three parts of glycerine, one part of distilled water, and one part of Buckley's formocresol. Now, this one part of Buckley's formocresol, again, it has a composition that is 19% formaldehyde, 35% of cresol, and 15% of glycerine. Now, again, this is a very, very important point, because in the exam they regularly ask regarding the composition of the Buckley's formocresol and how much percentage of formaldehyde is present in the Buckley's formocresol, and that is 19%. So maybe in the future exam they can ask you for the glycerol or the glycerine. Then the zones that is formed, again you need to remember that the zone that is formed is zone of fixation, the first zone, then the zone of fixation, then second is zone of atrophy, and the third is the zone of inflammation. Sorry, the first is the zone of fixation, then is the zone of atrophy, and the zone of inflammation. Okay. Now, you always need to remember that the first zone, that is zone of fixation, is basically a zone of coagulative necrosis, where you can say the entire structure of the cells remains, but the inner content is gone. That is why formocresol is also known as mummifying agent. Again, an important question that is asked in the exam, that formocresol is also known as a mummifying agent. Then, and this is the reason that the time period that we generally keep the pellet of the cotton pellet inside, or cotton pellet of the formocresol inside the chamber, is basically damped with formocresol. The cotton pellet is always damped with formocresol, and it is kept only for a duration of 5 minutes. So always ask in the exam that the cotton pellet that is placed inside the chamber should be damped, saturated, or wet. It should always be damped with formocresol. It means that you remove the excess amount of the formocresol. Then it is kept for a duration of 5 minutes. Now, there is a lot of confusion regarding the duration of the formocresol to be placed inside the chamber, and it is basically, the difference is basically, I told you that there are three zone forms, that is zone of fixation, atrophy, and inflammation, and this is the reason that if you place it for a longer duration, definitely the size of the zone will be more. So it is said that you keep it for a lesser duration. So according to the MCQs and according to the literature, what I have seen is that the recent guidelines say is that it should be kept for a duration for only for 1 minute. But When it comes to the MCQs, you always mark for 5 minutes. I repeat, you always mark for 5 minutes, because till now in the MCQs what I have seen is that they are marking for 5 minutes only, so go with 5 minutes only. But the recent guidelines are a little bit different, so till now they have not updated in the MCQs, so you keep it stuck with 5 minutes only. Okay. Then we have a pulpotomy by the name of glutaraldehyde. Now in the glutaraldehyde pulpotomy, I told you that it is kept for a duration of it is kept the glutar in the glutaraldehyde pulpotomy. I told you that it is kept for a duration of 3 to 4 minutes, and the concentration that is used in the case of glutaraldehyde pulpotomy is 2%. Now the question that is regularly asked importantly for the glutaraldehyde pulpotomy, that why it is preferred over the formicrystal pulpotomy. So always you need to remember that the molecular size of glutaraldehyde. So always remember that the molecular size of glutaraldehyde is more compared to that of the formicrystal. So you need to keep the cotton pellet of the glutaraldehyde pulpotomy for a duration of 3 to 4 minutes, and it is preferred because the molecular size is more compared to that of formicrystal. So the depth of penetration of glutaraldehyde will be less to the radicular pulp when we compare to the formicrystal, and in pulpotomy we are saving the radicular pulp also, so we don't want any damage to the radicular pulp. Whereas in the case of ferric sulfate, the important thing that you need to remember is that in case of ferric sulfate, again it's a better agent than the formicrystal, and it is used with a percentage of 15.5%. Since the concentration is more, the duration in the case of ferric sulfate will be less, and you leave a cotton pellet for only for 2 to 5 seconds. So this is the another important thing that you need to remember regarding the ferric sulfate. uh, the another important thing related to the, or you can say the procedure that is used in the pediatric endodontic is the Schweppes pulpotomy. I told you that Schweppes pulpotomy is the partial removal of the coronal pulp, whereas the pulpotomy that I discussed you, it is basically a complete removal of the coronal pulp, and that is done in a primary teeth. Whereas the Schweppes pulpotomy is indicated in the cases of the young permanent teeth, where you will do a partial removal of coronal pulp, that is 1 to 3 mm, and it is done when there is a traumatic or iatrogenic exposure. So when you are doing a Schweppes pulpotomy, where we basically remove the partial removal of the coronal pulp, you are covering the pulp with a layer of a calcium hydroxide or an MTA, followed by the permanent restoration. Now basically what you are doing is that you are not damaging the Herdwig epithelial root sheath cells, which are responsible for the closure of the apex. So you are preserving the, you can say, the viability of the cells, and this will help in the closure of the apex by its own. So it's known as a physiological process of root formation. So this entire thing that you are doing is for the procedure such as apexogenesis, which is also known as the physiological process of the root formation or the root completion of the root formation by its own. So always remember that Schweppes pulpotomy is the partial removal of the coronal pulp, and it aids in apexogenesis. The next is pulpectomy. A pulpectomy is the removal of the coronal as well as the radicular pulp. Now in the pulpectomy, the important points you need to remember is regarding the excess opening, and I told you that in the case of the excess opening, you always need to remember that the size of the chamber should be as wide as enough in the case of the primary teeth, because in case of primary teeth there is no shape as such. So we keep the chamber as wide as enough, so that we can remove the entire you can say the pulpal remnants, because in case of the primary teeth the pulp horns are high, and there are chances that you can leave the pulpal remnant, but you need to preserve the mesial marginal ridge and the distal marginal ridge. So always say that you remove the you do the excess opening in such a way that basically you open the tooth in such a way that the entire removal of the pulp is there, preserving the mesial and the distal marginal ridge. Then is the working line determination. I told you that in the case of the primary teeth, the working line determination, the best method is that you take the GP cones and you place it inside the you can say the canal, and you can take an X-ray, because in case of kids there are chances that when you place a file and you try to take the X-ray, there are chances that the child may close the mouth, or there are chances that there may be aspiration of the file. So to prevent this complication, we generally prefer that the working line is basically should have the safest method, and that is by placing a GP inside the canal, and then you can take an X-ray and you can have a roughly estimated working length. So if in the option they have not mentioned the gutta percha, then definitely the next most accepted method in the case of the working line determination is the radiographic method. Then is the biomechanical preparation, but in case of the primary teeth we never do a biomechanical preparation, we do a chemomechanical preparation. Another important point, because in case of the primary teeth the remaining dentin thickness is very less, so we prefer to do a less cutting in the case of the primary teeth compared to that of the permanent teeth. And that is why this is the reason that we are using the H files in the case of the primary teeth compared to that of the permanent teeth, so that there should be a complete extirpation of the pulp in case of the primary teeth. And finally is the obturation. Now I told you that for obturation two things important, that is the obturating material and the obturating device or the obturating technique. So the obturating material that is considered to be the most acceptable are basically in the case of primary teeth are the Metapex or the Vitapex, because the resorption rate is faster compared to that of the root resorption, but that is a disadvantage. But for that we again need to reinsert the calcium hydroxide, or that is the Metapex or the Vitapex, inside the canal. The another best material that we generally say in the case of the primary teeth is the endofloss. Uh, why we prefer endofloss is because what we have seen is that when we are using a zinc oxide retinol as an obturating material, its resorption rate is basically slow compared to that of root resorption. So what happens is that when the root tooth resorbs, we'll see the remnants of the zinc oxide retinol. So a combination is made, that is the combination of the calcium hydroxide, iodoform, and zinc oxide retinol, which is basically known as the endofloss. And this obturating material has the resorption rate almost equivalent to that of root resorption. But the only disadvantage with the endofloss is it's related to its setting time. The setting time that we see in the cases of the endofloss is much faster compared to that of the Metapex, or in the case of the zinc oxide retinol. And the obturating technique that is considered to be the best. Now we have discussed the various technique, but out of that the best technique that we generally recommend in the case of the primary teeth is the use of lentulospirals. So the lentulospirals are considered to be one of the best obturating technique when it comes to the primary teeth. The last thing that you need to remember in the case of pediatric endodontics is regarding the apexification. Always remember that apexification is a procedure that is done in a young permanent teeth, but it is done in a non-vital teeth. So it's really important to remember that the apexification is a procedure that is done in a non-vital teeth. And the material that are used basically for the apexification are either MTA, or one can use the combination of calcium hydroxide plus CMCP. CMCP is camphorated monochlorophenol. So camphorated monochlorophenol. So calcium hydroxide plus CMCP is considered to be one of the best material for the apexification procedure, and it is done in a young permanent teeth, but the tooth is non-vital. So this is regarding the pediatric endodontic procedure. Now starting with the next topic, that is the traumatology. Now the important points that you need to remember in the case of the traumatic dental injuries is basically the classification. Now I have discussed the classification of the traumatic dental injuries, especially for the primary teeth and the permanent teeth, in detail in my online videos. Now you please go through the classifications. These are really important, but not that it's not necessary that you need to mug up this classification. There are few terms that you need to remember in the classification. I told you during my lecture also that these terms are really important. So don't need to mug up the classification, because they will never ask you the classification in the MCQs. You need to understand the terms that are used in the classification. So I've discussed the classification for the primary teeth that is given by Rabinovich, and I've also discussed the Ellis and the Davies classification that is given in the year 1960. Then there is a classification by the Anderson and the classification by WHO. The important thing regarding the WHO classification is that they have the classification in the forms of the you can say in the form of numbers, and which generally starts from 873.60, but the number which is basically missing is 873.65, and the classification is starting from 873.60 to 873.69. So the number which is missing in the classification is 873.65. Always remember in the case of the WHO classification. And there is one question related to the classification which is regularly asked, that which classification of the traumatic dental injuries basically correlates to the Anderson classification, and it's only the WHO classification. The rest is basically regarding the introductory part of the traumatic dental injury, in which I told you that there are some important questions like which age group is more prevalent to the trauma in the primary dentition, and it is between the age group of 1.5 to 2 years, whereas which age group is more prevalent to the permanent dentition, and that is the age group between 8 to 11 years. So you need to remember these two things regarding the prevalence of the traumatic dental injuries in the primary as well as the permanent dentition. Then the traumatic dental injuries is seen more in boys or girls. Definitely it is seen more in the boys compared to the girls, with a ratio of 1.5 is to 1. then which malocclusion is more prevalent to trauma? Now this is again a common question that is asked in the exam, and it is class 2 div 1 malocclusion that is more prevalent to the traumatic dental injuries. Apart from that, the important part related to dermatology is basically the treatment part. Now the students generally get confused regarding the treatment part because the treatment part is totally different for the primary teeth and for the permanent teeth. So they generally mix up the guidelines of the primary and the permanent teeth. Now in my video also I told you that we have the new guidelines related to the treatment part of the traumatic dental injuries. So you need to remember the treatment part. So again in this video I'll be making you revise the treatment part for different, that is for the primary and the permanent teeth, and we'll be discussing the treatment according to the classification that is given by the Anderson, who basically classified the traumatic dental injuries into the injuries to the dental hard tissues and the pulp, the injuries to the periodontal tissues, the injuries to the supporting alveolar bone, and the injuries to the soft tissue. So when it comes to the injuries to the dental hard tissue, it basically involves the enamel fracture, or you can say the enamel infarction. Enamel infarction is basically when there is an incomplete fracture of the enamel. Then we have enamel infraction when you see a multiple fracture lines on the enamel surface. Then we have a fracture that is also known as the uncomplicated crown fracture or a complicated crown fracture. Uncomplicated crown fracture means a fracture that is involving the enamel dentine, and the complicated crown fracture means the fracture involving the enamel dentine and pulp. Similarly, we have a fracture that is known as uncomplicated crown root fracture, that is the fracture basically involving the enamel dentine and the cementum but not the pulp, and a complicated crown root fracture, that is a fracture involving the enamel dentine, cementum and pulp. So we have a different guidelines for each of the these injuries regarding the treatment part, but you guys please remember these terms because these terms are commonly asked in the exam, and that is why I am discussing in my this revision program also. The another important thing regarding the treatment part is that you always need to remember that now the recent guidelines says that we do a splinting in the case of the primary as well as the permanent teeth, and when it comes to the splinting is generally done with the wire that is 26 gauge or a 0.4 mm. Now this is an important thing that you need to remember when before we start with the treatment of the traumatic dental injuries, that splinting is generally done. And why we do a splinting? Because the first and the foremost thing that we generally do in the traumatic dental injuries is the splinting. And always remember that earlier the splinting that was done in the primary teeth is generally contraindicated, but now we generally recommend this splinting, and we call it as a semi-rigid splinting or a flexible splint. So 26 gauge wire is basically considered to be a flexible splint or a semi-rigid splint. So now we are doing a splinting in the primary teeth also. Earlier we were not doing, because we say that if the splinting is done with a harder wire, then it may lead to the, you can say it cause a damage to the, or it or it cause the lysis of the periodontal ligament cells, which may lead to the fusion of the teeth to the bone, that is also known as ankylosis. So this is the reason that the earlier guidelines were not suggesting the use of splinting in the primary teeth, but now the recent guidelines are suggested. So let's start with the treatment part. So if there is a fracture that is basically involving the, you can say the enamel and the dentine, if there is a fracture that is involving the enamel and the dentine, then what you can do is that there is a fracture. So what we'll do is we'll put a sedative dressing on the dentine so that to cover the exposed dentinal tubules, followed by a layer of a composite restoration. So sedative dressing may be the use of the calcium hydroxide, which is considered to be a biocompatible material, followed by the placement of the composite restoration. Now if there is a fracture that is involving the enamel, dentine and pulp, so we need to see in the case that if it's a primary teeth. So I told you that when there is an involvement of pulp, so a procedure such as direct pulp therapy is contraindicated in the primary teeth because the spread of infection is very fast and there is increased blood supply in the primary teeth. So in case of the primary teeth, if there is exposure, definitely whether the duration is within 72 hours, if the duration is less than 72 hours, definitely we can do a procedure such as pulpotomy. But if the duration exceeds greater than 72 hours, then we need to do with a procedure such as pulpectomy. So this is basically when the fracture is involving the enamel, dentine and the pulp. But there are cases that may involve the permanent teeth. So when the permanent teeth is involved, you always need to remember that whether it is a closed apex or it's an open apex. So in the case of closed apex, we know the treatment part is generally the root canal treatment. When there is involvement of pulp, we go for generally RCT. But in case of the open apex, we do the procedure such as the apexogenesis or apexification. But again, it depends upon that whether the pulp is vital or non-vital. So we do the procedure such as apexogenesis or apexification, depending upon that whether the pulp is vital or non-vital. So this is how we basically follow the treatment modalities when there is a fracture involving the enamel, dentine and the pulp. Then we have a different types of the luxation injuries, also known as the injuries to the periodontal tissues according to the Anderson classification. Now in the luxation injuries, we have such as concussion. Now in concussion, again it's very important because it's really asked in the exam. The concussion is basically a tooth is tender on percussion and there is no displacement and no mobility. So when it comes to the primary teeth or permanent teeth, what we do is basically we do a selective grinding of the opposite teeth so that we reduce the trauma to the teeth that is affected. So in this case, we'll not only do a palliative therapy, that is not only to give the medicine, but we'll also relieve the trauma. And the trauma is basically due to the when we are closing the jaw, then the opposing teeth may lead to a trauma to the affected teeth. So we relieve the trauma by grinding the opposing teeth. So that is done both in the primary as well as the permanent teeth. Then is subluxation. Now in this case, a tooth is tender on percussion. There is no displacement, but there is a mobility present. So in this case, for the primary teeth, generally we will do a splinting. And remember, I told you that splinting is done with a flexible splint that is using a 26 gauge wire. And the other important thing is that the duration of splinting should not exceed more than 1 to 2 weeks, because prolonged splinting can lead to the ankylosis in case of primary teeth. When it comes to the permanent teeth, for the subluxation, definitely will do a splinting. The other important luxation injury is intrusive luxation. Now, intrusive luxation is basically when the tooth is intruded inside the socket. Now, if the tooth is intruded inside the socket, it may cause the damage to the permanent tooth bud. So, the treatment for the primary teeth basically is that you take an IOP X-ray and confirm that whether the apex is basically causing a damage to the permanent teeth follicle or not. So for that confirmation, you need to take an IOP X-ray, and if you see in the IOP X-ray that if the tooth appears shorter in the IOP X-ray, that is the tooth which is affected appears shorter compared to the contralateral teeth, it means then the apex is displaced labially. So the tooth is the permanent tooth follicle is considered to be safe. But if the teeth appears elongated, that is the tooth which is affected appears to be elongated compared to the contralateral teeth. And another thing is that the apex of the tooth is not clear in the radiograph. Then this clearly demarcates that there are chances that the primary teeth is displaced palatally, and it may cause the damage to the permanent tooth bud follicle. So the another important thing is that in this case there are chances that you need to go for the extraction of the primary teeth, because it may cause the damage to the permanent tooth bud. And if the apex is displaced labially, then we no need to reposition it back, because we know that in the case of during the time of the presence of the primary dentition, because of the plasticity nature of the bone, the tooth will re-erupt on its own, and it is seen in the 90 to 95% of the cases in the primary dentition that the teeth re-erupt on its own when it comes to the primary teeth. Whereas in case of permanent teeth, one need to see that whether the apex is immature or the apex is mature. So immature means in the young permanent teeth. So basically in the young permanent teeth, we need to see that in the young permanent teeth, we generally wait and watch, and it is said that the time period that generally one should wait to see that the permanent teeth re-erupt on its own is basically 3 weeks. So always remember, this is really important, that is asked in the exam, that for how long the one should wait for the permanent teeth to re-erupt on its own, and that is 3 weeks. Whereas if the tooth does not re-erupt on its own within 3 weeks, then we'll say that okay, we'll go with a surgical repositioning or a orthodontic repositioning. Whereas in the case of the mature apex, generally we'll do a surgical repositioning followed by the or the orthodontic repositioning followed by the splinting. And the another important thing regarding the permanent teeth, it is said that if the extent of if the extent of the intrusion is basically greater than 7 mm, then the prognosis is poor in that cases. So one should not wait for the tooth to re-erupt on its own. And the time taken basically by the permanent teeth to re-erupt on its own in the oral cavity is generally around about 3 months. So these are the important things that one should remember for the case of the intrusive luxation in the primary as well as the permanent teeth. When it comes to the extrusive luxation, it is said that if the extrusive luxation in case of primary teeth is less than 3 mm, then then one can reposition it back and do the splinting. And remember, the splinting should not exceed for a period of 1 to 2 weeks. But if the extent of the extrusive luxation is greater than 3 mm, then one need to go for the removal of the primary teeth. In case of the permanent teeth, for the extrusive luxation, one should reposition the tooth back into the socket followed by splinting. Then is the lateral luxation. Now in the lateral luxation, I told you that if there is a mild lateral luxation or the displacement of the tooth along its long axis, then the thing is, because it may involve the fracture of the alveolar socket wall. So there are only two luxation injuries which basically involves the fracture of the alveolar socket wall, that is the intrusive luxation as well as the lateral luxation. So these two important points need to be remembered, that there are two luxation injuries which involves the fracture of the alveolar socket wall, that is the intrusive luxation and the lateral luxation. So when there is a lateral luxation in the case of the you can say in the primary teeth, and it is not causing any hindrance in the occlusion, then you leave it as such. But if it is causing a slight hindrance in the occlusion, then for relieving the occlusion, you will need to do a selective grinding of that particular teeth, or you can reposition it back and do the splinting part. But if if the lateral luxation is basically causing, or if the lateral luxation is severe, then one may need to go for the extraction of the primary teeth. In case of the permanent teeth, especially for the lateral luxation injury, one need to disengage the apex of the tooth, because there are chances that the permanent teeth may engage into the alveolar bone. So one may need to disengage the apex of the tooth and then stabilize it back, followed by the splinting. Okay, so this is regarding the lateral luxation injuries. And the last, that is the most important, is the avulsion. Now avulsion is also known as the exarticulation, that is the complete displacement of the tooth out of the socket. So for the late relaxation in my lecture also I told you regarding the guidelines that is given by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, and the guidelines are basically based on the management of the open apex or the close apex. But I told you that you just remember the 5 conditions in which generally the avulsion may take place. The first is that the tooth is immediately reimplanted at the accident site, or if the extraoral time is less than 20 minutes but the tooth was then transported into the HBSS solution. The third guideline is that if the tooth was kept in moist in the water, saliva or other non-physiological medium. Then the fourth condition is 20 to 60 minutes with extra oral dry time or the storage, and the last is the greater than 60 minutes. So these things you need to remember when it comes to the traumatic dental injuries. And you need to remember these 5 conditions both in the case of the open apex as well as in the close apex. So it is said that if the tooth was immediately reimplanted at the accident site, then what you will do? You will do the splinting. Okay, if the extraoral time is less than 20 minutes and it was transported into the HBS solution, then you transfer the tooth into directly into the antibiotic solution, that is you use a doxycycline solution. So again, it's a question that is asked in the exam regarding the treatment or regarding the antibiotic that is used in the case of the avulsion. Then if the tooth was kept moist in the water, saliva or any other non-physiological medium for 20 to 60 minutes, then you need to transport the tooth back into the HBS solution first, because it was transported in a non-physiological medium. So you need to first transfer it into a physiological medium. Always remember there are two types of the medium, physiological and non-physiological. In the non-physiological medium, we have the saliva, we have milk, water, handkerchief, buccal vestibule. So these are basically a non-physiological medium. Then we have a physiological medium such as Hank's balanced salt solution, a Biospan. These are considered to be one of the best physiological medium. So what the condition was that the tooth was transported in a non-physiological medium with a duration of 20 to 60 minutes. So we are transferring it back into the HBS solution, then placing it in the antibiotic solution followed by splinting. Then the fourth condition is that the tooth is placed for 20 to 60 minutes with the extra oral dry storage time. That was the tooth was not kept neither in a physiological nor in a non-physiological medium. So we directly transfer the tooth into the HBS solution, followed by the placement into an antibiotic solution, and then we'll do a splinting. But it is said that if the duration generally exceeds greater than 60 minutes, then it is said that generally there is a loss of the viability of the periodontal ligament cells. Then it is no, then it doesn't make a sense to preserve the teeth into any physiological or a non-physiological medium, because it is said that the viability of the periodontal ligament cell is gone. So in this case, first we'll basically clean the tooth surface with the help of a 3% citric acid solution, and we'll keep the tooth in a citric acid solution for 3 minutes. After doing that, we'll transport the teeth into the fluoride solution. That is, we'll use 1.23% of sodium fluoride or the APS solution. Now generally we keep it for 5 to 20 minutes. The purpose of using the you can say the tooth transferring the tooth into the fluoride solution is because we know that the biggest disadvantage of reimplanting the teeth back into the socket, and that too when the time period exceeds greater than 60 minutes, the disadvantage is that there are chances of resorption. So to avoid or to you can say to prevent the teeth from the resorption, we generally applied a remineralizing layer of the fluoride, which basically plays an important role in the you can say the role of plays an important role in the remineralization. So that is why we are using a fluoride solution. So these conditions are same for the open apex and the close apex. But when it comes to the open apex, one need to see that whether we can go for a procedure such as the apexification. But when it comes to the close apex, one can do a root canal treatment outside the socket only, and then can place the tooth back into the socket. Whereas but he need to be fast, because if the duration is within 60 minutes, then doing a root canal outside the mouth becomes difficult. So it's better to place the tooth back into the socket. But if the time period exceeds greater than 60 minutes, then one can perform the root canal outside and then place the tooth back into the socket, followed by the stabilization. The another important thing that you need to remember in the case of the avulsion, that is very important, that the duration of the splinting is basically more when compared to the other luxation injuries. And the other important thing is that if one need to initiate a root canal, especially in the case of the close apex, one can only initiate a root canal in the case of close apex after 7 to 14 days of splinting, because once the tooth has achieved its stabilization, then one should go for a root canal. It doesn't mean that once we have splinted the teeth, we start doing a root canal, because it may hamper the stabilization of the teeth. So the root canal should be initiated only after 7 to 10 days of splinting. So always remember, this is a very important question that is asked in the exam regarding the initiation of the root canal after the splinting in the case of avulsion. The last thing that is left in the or to, need to revise in the case of the traumatic injuries is regarding the root fractures. Now the treatment for the root fractures in the case of the primary teeth, we generally say that you always extract the fragment coronal to the fractured part. So if the fracture is suppose between the cervical and the middle third, so we always prefer to extract the segment coronal to the fractured part. The reason is that it is said that you leave the root segment as such. If you are able to remove it easily, then remove it, but if it finds difficult, then leave it as such, because there is a process known as physiological root resorption. So this piece of root will get resolved on its own. So no need of removing the fractured part of the root from the socket with the help of the levators or the elevator, because that may cause a damage to the permanent tooth bud. So in the case of the root fractures, especially for the primary teeth, you leave it as such. The another thing is that when it comes to the permanent teeth, we say that the root fractures are divided into three parts, that is the apical third, middle third, and the cervical third. And we generally say that the prognosis of the fracture at the apical third is the best. Now again, an important question that is asked in the exam, and the fracture that is at the cervical third is considered to be poor. The reason is because the exposed cervical part is always in the contact with the saliva. So and the other important thing is that the stabilization will be very very difficult in the case of the fracture at the cervical third. So we always say that the prognosis is best in the apical third compared to the cervical third. Then some then the next thing is injuries to the soft tissue. That includes basically laceration, contusion, and abrasion. Now you need to remember these three things for the exam. Generally, the laceration and the contusion are most commonly asked, and the question that is generally asked in the exam related to the soft tissue injuries, that laceration is basically caused by which instrument? The laceration is caused by the sharp instrument, whereas the contusion is basically caused by which instrument? The contusion is caused by a blunt instrument. The laceration is basically the tear of the tissue, and the contusion is basically submucosal, or you can say it's a type of a bruise. So that is basically contusion, and abrasion is basically the rubbing or the scraping of the gingival surface. The next and the last important thing that you need to always revise before you end up with the traumatic dental injuries is regarding the duration of the splinting when it comes to the permanent teeth. And I told you that I have given you a chart. Please learn this chart which I have given you in my lecture also regarding the duration of splinting. Always remember that when the root fracture is at the cervical one third, the duration of the splinting increases to 4 months. And if the avulsion, especially in the avulsion, if the dry time exceeds greater than 60 minutes, again remember the duration of the splinting is increased, and that is around about 4 weeks. So this is the thing that you always need to remember when it comes to the duration of splinting. Please remember this chart because they can ask you for any of the traumatic dental injuries. Now after revising the traumatic dental injuries, we'll revise some important points related to the topic, that is the development of occlusion. Now in the development of occlusion, always remember regarding the gum pads. And I told you that these are the alveolar processes that are present at the time of birth. The maxillary gum pad is basically horseshoe shape, and the mandibular gum pad is basically U shape. These two gum pads generally contact in the first molar region, resulting into an anterior open bite, which is also helps in a pattern known as infantile swallow. Now this gum pads basically consist of different types of the groove. So you need to remember the types of groove. The first is the gingival groove. Then we have dental groove, transverse groove, and the last is the lateral sulci or the lateral groove. Now remember that the gingival groove basically separates the gum pad from the palate in the case of the maxillary arch, and in the mandibular arch it separates from the floor of the mouth. Whereas the dental groove, it extends from the first molar region to the it extends from the incisive area to the first molar region. And the transverse groove, now these transverse grooves basically corresponds to the succedaneous primary tooth bud that are present inside the gum pads, and these are 10 in number, 10 in the maxillary arch and 10 in the mandibular arch. Lexis, the lateral sulci, I told you that the lateral sulci is the groove that is present between the canine and the first molar region. So please remember this groove because they are most commonly asked in the, if you see the last year question papers, the grooves are basically asked from the gum pads. So don't leave these gum pads. Then I told you that these gum pads generally helps in a pattern known as the infantile swallow. Now this infantile swallow converts to a mature swallow. Now this is the most common question they ask you, that at what time the infantile swallow converts to a mature swallow. It converts to a mature swallow with the introduction of first you can say semi-solid food into the diet, or it get converted with the eruption of the first molar. So these two important things, or the two important points related to the conversion of infantile swallow to the mature swallow, is generally asked in the exam. Please remember it. That is with the introduction of first solid semi-solid food into the diet, or with the eruption of the first molar. Then in the pre-dentate period, when you see the teeth sometimes are present at the time of birth, and it is known as the natal teeth. And the teeth that erupts during the first 30 days of the life is basically known as the neonatal teeth. Now in the exam, they generally ask you regarding the management part of the natal teeth. So always remember that when it comes to the management of the natal teeth, we never go for the extraction of the natal teeth. I told you because in infants there is a deficiency of vitamin K, so the formation of the clot mechanism is not there. So in that case, what you can do is that you grind the natal teeth till the level of the alveolar gum pads and leave it as such. But always remember that in the question they should have mentioned that the natal teeth generally cause difficulty during the feeding process. If they have written that the natal teeth is causing a difficulty during the feeding process, then only you will go with the grinding of the natal teeth. If they write it down that the child at the time of birth present with the natal teeth and they have not mentioned that this natal teeth is causing any problem, then we'll say wait and watch. So please remember they have given the question in two forms regarding the management part of the natal teeth. Then the dentition, I told you that it is divided into three parts. The first is the primary dentition. Then we have mixed dentition. and the last is the permanent dentition. Always remember in these three forms regarding the development of occlusion. So in the primary dentition, the first teeth that we know that it erupts into the oral cavity is the mandibular central incisor, and it erupts at the age of 6 months. Then the primary dentition completes by the age of 2.5 to 3 years. Another important question that is asked in the exam, that at what age the primary set of dentition completes. It completes by the age of 2.5 to 3 years. Then we know that there are three types of the molar relationship that is present in the primary dentition. That is the flush terminal plane, the mesial step, and the distal step, and that is basically related to the distal surface of the primary second molar. Now the first terminal plane, always remember that it transforms into a class 1 molar relationship, whereas the mesial step transforms into a class 1, but it sometimes transforms into a class 3 molar relationship. Now this is a very important question that is asked, that at what stage the mesial step transforms into a class 3 molar relationship, and it basically transforms into a class 3 molar relationship because of the differential forward growth of the mandible continues. If the differential, that is the downward and the forward growth of the mandible persists, then the mesial step transforms into a class 3 molar relationship, whereas the distal steps transforms into a class 2 molar relationship. So this is something related to the primary dentition. When it comes to the mixed dentition is always divided into three parts that I told you. That is the first transitional period, the second transitional period, uh, sorry, the first transitional period, then we have not the second transitional period, then we have intertransitional period, and then comes the second transitional period. So in the first transitional period, the things that you'll see is that is the first molar erupt. Now the another important thing that comes in the exam is regarding the eruption of the first molar is that this eruption of the first molar basically take place by two mechanisms, that is the early mesial shift and late mesial shift. Now the early mesial shift take place when the physiological spaces or the primate spaces are present, then the first molar erupts into the oral cavity. But sometimes this physiological space or the primate spaces are absent, then it takes place in the late mesial shift. Then there is another important question related to the primate spaces, that what are the primate spaces, or they can give you an image based question. The primate spaces are the spaces that is present mesial to the maxillary canine, mesial to the maxillary canine, and distal to the mandibular canine. And distal to the mandibular canine. Then the another important thing that takes place in the first transition period, and that is asked in the exam, is regarding the exchange of the incisors. Now the questions that comes generally related to the exchange of the incisor is basically the incisor liability,